Okay, so this is Chapter P, Section 7, Part 3, and in the last video we talked about the steps for solving quadratic equations. We want it equal to 0, we want to factor, making sure we pull out the GCF. We're going to use the zero product property and solve and check our answers. Now looking at our first example here, I noticed that all of these numbers are divisible by 2. So dividing by 2, I get 2x squared plus 7x equals 4. And I want to set it equal to 0, so we subtract 4 from both sides. And now I want to factor. Now we have a few options for factoring here. We can usually use the quadratic formula, but I have a method that I like that if you don't like the way you factor, this might be really helpful for you. And I call it the X method. And when we use the X method, if this is my A, my B, and my C value, then up top I want my A times my C, and on the bottom I want my B value. And what I want is two numbers here that when I multiply them, I get A times C, and when I add them, I get my B value. Now for this specific example, my A times C is 2 times -4, and that's -8. And my B value is 7, so I'm wanting two numbers that when I multiply them give me -8, and when I add them give me 7. Well, that's going to be 8 and -1. And now I'm going to take my A value, 2x plus 8, and 2x minus 1. Now, I know here I have an extra 2 in here. I know that I have too many of them. And this step I call taking out the trash. Okay, because I know I have extra factors in there. Now whichever one of these factors has that extra 2, that's where we're taking out the trash. And again, with this method, you have to take out the GCF at the very beginning like we did. So I have x plus 4 and 2x minus 1 equals 0. So x equals -4 and x equals 1/2. And looking at our next example here, we can, because we don't have a B value, I can add this to the other side. And I can divide by 3. And when I take the square root, remember that plus or minus has to go in the front. So we have x is equal to plus or minus 5. Now the next example is something that students generally struggle with. I'm not going to go over this yet, but after I do the next example, I want you to come back and read through these steps once we've already done an example. And I think that will help you understand the process a little bit. So we're going to dive right into an example. And we have solving completing the square, we have 3x squared plus 6x minus 15. Now, using those steps that we were just looking at, we want first to have our A value be 1. We need this to be a 1. So I notice all three terms are divisible by 3, which is nice. So dividing by 3, we get x squared plus 2x minus 5 equals 0. And now what we're going to do is we're going to try and create a perfect square. Okay. Now I want to have my constant on the other side. So I have x squared plus 2x, and I'm going to say plus something equals, adding 5 to the other side, 5. And if I add something to one side, I have to add it to the other side. Now what's going to go in this box is our b value divided by 2, all squared. Okay, so my b value is 2, divided by 2 is 1, squared is 1. And now this is a perfect square. Now in order to factor this perfect square, we're going to have x, bring down this sign here, and it's just going to be b divided by 2. And 2 divided by 2 is just 1. And 5 plus 1 was 6. And now we have x plus 1 squared equals 6. So I can take the square root of both sides, again, plus or minus. And I have x plus 1 equals plus or minus square root 6. And then to solve, I just need to subtract 1. So I have x equals -1 plus or minus square root 6. And that is my answer. Now we have the quadratic formula right here, and most of you will be familiar with this. So this is my a, this is my b, and this is my c. And x is equal to negative b, so -1 plus or minus the square root of b squared minus 4 times my a value times my c value all over 2 times a, which in this case is going to be 10. And now we just need to simplify. And we have 4 times 5 is 20, times 2 is -40, but times a negative is a positive, so 41 over 10. And there's nothing we can simplify, so that's our answer. Now the discriminant here tells us some information. It does not solve it for us, but what it tells us is that it tells us how many solutions we have and what kind of solutions they are. So if when we find this value here, if it is positive, if it gives us a positive number, we have 2 real solutions. If it equals 0, then we have 1 real solution. And if it's negative, we have no real solutions, but we do have 2 complex solutions. Okay? Now, an example of solving radical equations, if we have something like what we see right here, I want to try and solve this. And the first thing I need to do is get the radical by itself. So subtracting 2, I have root 2x minus 1 equals x minus 2. And then I want to square both sides. And I have 2x minus 1 equals, I need to FOIL this out, and I get x squared minus 4x plus 4. And subtract 2x plus 1. I get 0 equals x squared minus 6x plus 5. And I can factor this. And I get x equals 5 and x equals 1. But I need to check my answers. If I plug in 5 here, 5 times 2 is 10, minus 1 is 9, square root of 9 is 3, 3 plus 2 is 5, and so that one works out. And if I plug in 1, 2 times 1 is 1, 2 times 1 is 2, 2 minus 1 is 1, square root of 1 is 1, plus 2 is 3. Well, 3 is not equal to 1, so this solution does not work. And that is the end of section 7.